That's a life skill as well as a professional skill and professional requirement, the life requirement, I think, as well, that introspection. There are ways you can do that. I think listening is one, and seeking feedback, particularly from people that you trust and people who know you.
I welcome you to our SuperLawyer YouTube channel. Today, we are here to welcome Mr. Stephen Pitt Walker, who is a non-executive director, a CEO, lawyer, a business strategist, a board governance officer, and he has also developed Board Digital Portfolio, which is trademarked, where he works around AI, cybersecurity, emerging technologies, and different variety of digital transformations. He has been a keynote speaker as well. He has been a good friend of mine, and that was the reason I invited, so that he can impart his years of experience with the law graduates and the professionals who will be watching this channel. So I welcome you, Stephen, here at our YouTube channel. The super lawyer concept came out from the LawSikho heads. They wanted new generation lawyers, or rather first generation lawyers, to understand how they can enter the corporate world without having any godfather, and they can make their way. We invite the lawyers or the business heads like you, who can actually tell them how they can work their ways through these kind of corporate entities, where you already have headed so many, and you have taken care of Asia, you have been to Singapore, you have your own concept about everything, you have been to executive program of Wharton as well, where you can tell us about how corporate governance works, because this is kind of new thing. And currently Stephen is doing his PhD also, which is in corporate governance. So I guess this connection is absolutely amazing, where our learners will be knowing a lot more about how to get into this kind of field, which is very, very new for many of us. So first, I would like to welcome you again, and would like to ask you the very first and formative question. What prompted you to do law? And my request would be to please give a brief overview of your background, and how did you diverse your professional journey, including the roles which you have played in making Gartner, HP, Honeywell, and the kind of contributions which your expertise in corporate governance and executive leadership has helped them establish their entities in different continents.
Thank you so much, Divya. It's lovely to be here. Thank you again. A very interesting set of questions, and a wonderful audience, and wonderful concept as well. I think great value, and interesting to think on these things from my point of view. They're not things that I dwell on or introspect on necessarily all the time. So the question that you asked, that first question, that has a number of parts, of course. So I'll start with a background question, and I think maybe it will tease out some of the career progression that I've had over the last nearly 40 years. It's scary to say that number sometimes, but nonetheless, it's certainly been interesting, and I've enjoyed my career very much, and I enjoy the interdisciplinary approaches and also nature of my role now. And the way that I've developed that, I think, is probably important to the question too. What prompted me to come to the law? I had, in the military, been studying the law. The first part of my career was in the military. I served regimentally as an officer. I'm a graduate of the Royal Military College of Australia, Duntroon. I'm also a graduate of the Australian Defence Force Academy and Australian Intermediate Staff College. I served in a number of different varied roles, but one of which, and the last space indeed, of which was as an intelligence officer. I had a degree in political science, international relations, and I think naturally there was a tendency during that time to tend towards an understanding of international law from having served on operations overseas with the United Nations and others. And also organizationally, I was beginning to understand and having my first inklings about organization performance and what good performance meant in terms of not just leadership and management, which was certainly something that every military officer is trained in, I think probably chosen for in terms of potential, but also in terms of working then later with senior officers, very senior military officers on headquarters, and briefing them, seeing governance and strategy being developed, being a part of that briefing process, whether that was in an operational unit or whether it was in a headquarters unit that was strategic, more strategic, such as in intelligence roles. Naturally, that progresses into law. I think there's a natural progression into law out of all of that, a humanitarian sense, and I definitely had that, and I do a lot of pro bono work in human rights advocacy. I still do that. I sit on boards of human rights organisations. I've been a lawyer and advocate for human rights organisations, both in Australia and around the world. And I think that when I left the military, when I chose to leave the military and go back to university, it was through that experience of studying my first master's that I came back to the law as well. I also found through my network that I was introduced to an extremely important figure in my life, which was a Supreme Court Justice of the Supreme Court in Australia. And he became an exceptionally important mentor for me and still is, even though he's 93 now and today is not as active in the law. He still writes about the law and we still talk about the law. That was in Queensland. So I then came back to the law, the study of the law at that stage, having completed honours, first class honours in political science and a master's in international relations, international studies, with a focus on Asia mainly, although it was broader, but mainly a focus on Asia, the Asia Pacific. So that was how I came to the law through that process. I've weaved in and out of the law since then, specifically practicing business law as well as corporate law. I include that in business law today, so commercial contract in particular, and cyber and technology law, and now with an interest, as you say, from a corporate governance point of view in artificial intelligence law as well. So AI regulation, AI ethics, AI governance. I think that's the connection, with a significant influence of cyber and cybersecurity and cyber law, because the whole of that creates a regulatory complexity multiplier, as I term that in my business or my practice, my global practice, which is Optima Board Services Group. And that complexity creates governance and ethics issues for corporations. So I mainly provide services today to corporates, having been a senior executive in, for example, Honeywell, owning automation of processes, process control system and automation, an automation unit, particularly in the software end, the collaborative manufacturing solutions end, which is really about IoT or industrial IoT. That's what we would call that today. Though I think there's more to it than that as well. It was about supply chain. It was about integration of supply chain. So I've been involved in that from a mining and resources point of view. That was with Honeywell in providing that to mining corporations around the world. It was a global role, as well as more strategic IT roles or strategic advisory roles as a vice president in Gartner Consulting Asia Pacific, looking after mainly the financial sector or the financial services industry sector vertical, but beyond that as well. So it was quite a broad role too. I've been a chief strategy officer as well in some substantial listed small to medium enterprises. And I've, of course, got another master's in economics and finance. Throughout that time, I think there's probably only been about 8 years when I haven't been formally studying something. I've enjoyed that very much. I've also practiced in the strategic advisory sector, mainly in technology firms, but on the business consulting side as well. I owned the business consulting solution when I was at Gartner. And that, of course, drives IT and IT strategy. So we were very heavily involved in that. That brings us up to date. I've more recently established Optima Board Services Group. It's developing nicely. There's a hard launch. It's had a soft launch. We're having a hard launch, and that will be in around about February, March. I'm a fellow of the Governance Institute of Australia as well. And I'm a certified cybersecurity professional. I'm also a accredited strategy practitioner with the Strategic Management Institute in Australia. So it's quite eclectic. And I think I bring all of those today to the cross-section of law and technology and business. Ethics and morality, hopefully, as well, which is very important. We'll talk more about that as we go.
Wow, just the word wow comes to mind when you are talking about your achievements and the things that you have done throughout your life in and around law. The kind of experience you have had regarding advising the corporate boards, what kind of approach do you take when you have to do it from within the corporate boards, and kind of strategies you can maybe share with the new entrants in the field, that how do you find it most effective when creating a long-term value for the businesses, and what kind of strategies these new entrants in corporate governance can take and build their expertise around?
Yes, this is a question of building capacity, but also providing stewardship in terms of our own deliverables, in terms of what we deliver and how we deliver it as well. One of the things that I say about or in Optima is that we believe it's crucial that the board is a prime agent of positive, sustainable, effective change. No longer can boards consider themselves a tick box organisation, nor a compliance requirement organisation. I use the term organisation, a governance body, if you will, but I'll just use the term organisation because it is a formation of people, an ordering of people. It's a different one, but nonetheless, it's extremely important. And of course, it has the role of the head. Leadership, and not necessarily management, but leadership to management, begins, I believe, in the boardroom. And so it must take a leadership position. And in order to take a leadership position, you must be active. You must take the initiative. And so in order to support the board, and this is the prime objective, I think, of my contribution and the way I perceive Optima, is to do that in a collaborative way, certainly through collaboration, education, and capacity building. So, and often that will be done differently. It certainly will be done differently by myself than people who are listening to the recording, perhaps who are more at the start of their career or in the early mid stages of their career. And so you've got to be aware of the context and your own context as well. So delivering to the board, and everyone will deliver in some way to the board, will differ. It will be variegated in accordance with your role, where you sit in the organisation, the priorities of the organisation and the strategic objectives that are agreed in the organisation, and then the requirements that surround that. So I think building long-term value or creating long-term value is something which is done over time. And you have to manage, of course, the dynamics of the boardroom and help the board structure itself and support its decisions with timely, accurate information. And I would add there that brevity, accuracy, and clarity are really important because the board doesn't have much time. That's something we need to note as well. So they have to assimilate a lot of information and make decisions on it very, very quickly. So brevity, clarity, accuracy. And that means that we need to be really concise as well. We need to be a one-pager out of 100 pages.
Thank you so much for that insightful view. But the kind of business risks which you must have dealt around cybersecurity or in financial aspects, digital world, and the kind of regulatory compliances which you have been going through, what kind of process or what kind of ways one should work around to make it effectively imparted in the kind of recommendations that you gave, or you would like to do it for the next generation as well, as in what kind of recommendations should effectively mitigate and manage these critical risks? And the way you said that obviously it should be concise, how do you process all this information from 100 pager to 1 pager, and what are your strategies to mitigate these kind of business risks? What are your views and how one can equip themselves in doing so?
I think none of us has all of the information that we require in an information asymmetric world, not all the answers, therefore we can't provide solutions lickety split, and we can't provide all the solutions to all the questions of the board. So you must limit yourself and focus. You must focus on certain aspects. So from a board advisory perspective, that means that you need to take a limited but deep approach to the aspects, say, for example, in technology in the board digital portfolio, you need to make sure that you're across all of the major elements of that. And it helps to have a career that spans 35 years in technology or more. I managed high tech in the military and came to know tech and communications and the intricacies of that, and also the risks around that very, very clearly in the military. So even from there and beyond, you can't do everything. So we need to pick some things and then specialize to some degree, while also recognizing we need a little knowledge on everything as well. We can probably have a few things in our quiver, a few arrows in our quiver, but we can't do everything. So in order to serve the board, we must ensure that we're delivering with expertise, and that expertise and authority, I would say as well, not just expertise, but that we're maintaining an authoritative understanding of our spaces, and then work with other people to provide a collaborative view to other areas, for example. So we need to be specializing, but we also need to be broad enough that we understand and have an understanding of how to go, where to go to, and what the broad issue is, so that we can provide or tap somebody on the shoulder in order to help with that. And that might be our partners. It might be people working in the firm. It might be people that we know in our network who can provide that as well. And I think that this is, again, the collaboration orientation, which is an Optima view, is exceptionally important. And that also includes another Optima word, which is reciprocity. So mutual alignment, that's a value statement, mutual support and mutual benefit, and collaborating towards those goals.
Thank you for sharing all this. It's very insightful. And now I would like to move to the kind of exposure that you have had related to geopolitical and geoeconomic landscapes while you were talking about international laws. How has it influenced your approach in order to make the decision or support or strategize for the advisory purposes, and the kind of cross-cultural challenges that you must have faced while leading these global teams or advising the boards with variety or diverse backgrounds? What was your approach then? How did you deal with these issues?
It's a very important question, because every organization has its own concerns. But it's embedded within an industry and a market, which is embedded within a jurisdiction, which is embedded within a global jurisdiction and a global order, commercial, as well as political order, that is politico-economic order. So particularly for any firm to understand supply chains is really important. To understand its markets, really important. And that may be even more important if the firm is operating globally or internationally. So the the geopolitical and geoeconomic concerns, and we have some very good examples today of how they will impact from both an operating view and a regulatory view, are extremely important to understand and provide information on, but again, concisely. And that requires maintaining the expertise, I think, as well as both from a compliance, conformance perspective, as well as a performance perspective, which is value creation oriented. The board has to perform today. In order to do that, again, it needs to understand very well, and it needs to be updated probably regularly, but it also needs to understand itself that members of the board need to be aware of. They need to be watching the news. They need to be thinking about these sorts of things as well as it pertains to the company that they're serving in agency of, for example, shareholders, but other key stakeholders as well, internal and external. And again, one of the things I would suspect that's important to do and would propose doing is to make sure that wherever you are, you maintain your pestel, you maintain that risk analysis. It's also an opportunity analysis as well. You know, pestel to me could equally relate to SWOT. And then you can work the strategic objectives back and forth. So reverse engineer and engineer between those so that you understand how you can best achieve your strategic objectives by managing and mitigating risk, whether it's operating or regulatory, or preserve value as well in that equation. So it's both value creation and value preservation that we need to be aware of and decisioning for. And certainly every single strategic objective has risks that are related to that. And we need to analyse those risks in a risk management framework, an objective-centric risk management framework in respect of each strategic objective, and then each other strategic objective, but also then between the strategic objectives and how those risks interrelate between those as well. So it's a big exercise, and it's not a matter of a matrix tick box exercise. This requires discussion, but it requires a level of knowledge to enter the discussion. So board papers are extremely important in this equation too. Good, clear, concise, and accurate, but brief board papers, we could say as short as possible, but as long as necessary, with the caveat that we need to be clear, concise, accurate. So that helps the board to come into a decision-making space and to be provided then with some decision support, for example, by board advisors who might also inform board papers, but might also inform the board directly during board meetings by very short, intense bursts of information and briefing, which is all about decision support.
The kind of advisory style which you have developed for yourself, and it has helped you work across a range of industries, which include, obviously, are not limited to technology consulting, telecommunications, energy, and financial services as well. How did you adapt to the kind of leadership or advisory style for these kind of unique challenges and these kind of dynamic sectors which you have worked in? What helped you build your style in order to make it brief, adequate, and all the amazing optimization techniques which you have developed till now? I would love to hear that for our listeners.
And you've raised some really good points there. And as I think on the question that you've asked, two things come to mind. One is people, and one is industry. So how have I developed my style? I think I've been very, very fortunate to have worked for some fantastic people and to be mentored by some fantastic people. So I would advise everyone to seek mentorship and a personal relationship with mentors as well. And that's an art. And sometimes there's a little bit of luck involved in that. It's who you meet and how you meet them and the impression that you make. So to me, and that's sometimes just being in the right place at the right time. But it's amazing how you do make your own luck if you are in those places doing the right thing, being what you are, And that's a values statement as well, being who you really are. So knowing yourself and being self-aware are incredibly important things. I'm not pretending for a moment that I have always been very self-aware. I'm not even pretending that I'm always self-aware now. What I'm saying is that we all need to develop that and try and understand ourselves as we go through the journey. That's a life skill as well as a professional skill and professional requirement, life requirement, I think, as well, that introspection. There are ways you can do that. I think listening is one, and seeking feedback, particularly from people that you trust and people who know you and the mentors that you might develop. And sometimes you won't necessarily feel like a mentor is exactly a mentor until one day you think, oh, wow, they've done so much for me and I've learned so much from them. That was being mentored. But I think having some very specific ones is really important too. The other thing I would say on the technocratic side is industry knowledge is exceptionally important. And I remember when I first left the army and came out of university again and back into the private sector, and I was beginning to advise and practice and engage with industry. And I did that at not a junior level because of the military experience, I guess. I did that at somewhat a mid-level managing kind of level. And I think the thing I had in mind most was I want to understand. I want to know everything there is to know, for example, about the energy industry. That was, to me, oil and gas and electricity. At the time, I was consulting into those industries, for example. When I did that, I went to grassroots and I learned as much as I could about the industries, from poles and wires all the way to the software that was being used to manage networks, to the organization structure, to pressures and pressure gauges from or across the network, from generation to distribution to retail. This is just one example. I did the same in telco. I wanted to know telco inside out. And so I learned telco inside out. At the same time, learning commercialization and other business aspects. And then M&A, stepped on to M&A and got involved in large M&A outsourcing activities. And from there went on with that. But I think at every stage in any space, I wanted to know the industry and sector I was working in very, very well. So if I spent a few years in telco and I spent a few years in energy, or I spent a few years, probably more than a few years, in some of these sectors, I got to know them as well as I possibly could, again, by talking to people, and understanding, just gaining as much understanding as I could of the embedded context of that, whether that was the legal regime, regulatory regime, the pricing models, the technologies, the operating models, the business processes, but all of that, and skills as well. Not that I ever became an engineer, I don't pretend, but again, I've got a relatively good engineering mindset, mainly because probably the military mindset to some degree is similar to an engineering mindset as well. So I would say people in every context, and industry knowledge exceptionally important, and then build your package or your portfolio of business knowledge around that as well. So there's the technical, there's the industry, and then your own business knowledge as well, which is an application and development of your schooling and your training. For example, as a lawyer, going on from contract into higher level contract, into negotiation of contracts, small, medium, very large. Take yourself there and get to know those spaces very well, which are your business skills.
All this is so educative. I cannot explain in words how much am I learning. You have done almost everything which is there in the business law world, from M&A, from contracts, from a variety of negotiations, mediations, and everything. Through that, you have developed a long list of prominent clients like ANZ Bank, Rio Tinto, Ericsson's, etc. how do you approach building and maintaining these kind of strong relationships with such diverse clientele, diverse industry? There is not one kind of industry which you have tapped into. You practically have entered in almost all kind of diverse industries. How did you approach doing this? What kind of approach one should think of while they are developing these relationships, and then in maintaining that for a longer period of time?
Yes, it's a really good question. I'm not sure that I'll give an answer, but I'm not sure that I know exactly how I did that. It's difficult to say how we build and maintain relationships, but all relationships are based on trust. And so I guess there's some element of the previous answer that gets involved in this, because you need to have credibility, particularly in a professional sense, to be legitimate and be taken legitimately, and then to be listened to strategically as an advisor. So trust is really important. Developing the knowledge from what I said a moment ago is exceptionally important to that. I think communicating is really important too. Listening is communication. Listening to understand and representing to your clients and your interlocutors what they're saying and what their needs are. So it's about requirements, understanding requirements and replaying that, but also taking it a little bit further and recognizing gaps in what they've said to fill those proactively as well. I think so, that idea of mutual alignment, mutual support, and mutual benefit, we could add something there, and we could say a mutual trust. Yeah, a mutuality in terms of trust. I think probably that's the core. Trust is built on reliability, on dependability, on transparency to an extent, though we don't need to be, nor should we be, wholly transparent. Transparency is proportionate. I think we get that wrong sometimes when people are talking transparency as a principle of good governance. Absolutely it is, as is integrity, as is the rule of law, and there are many others. But transparency, we don't need to be throwing the kimono open completely, but we need to do it to the extent that people understand what they need to understand and what is appropriate and relevant. So I would say that as well. So the cornerstone of trust is really important, and that leads to mutual respect, and that leads to relationship and stronger relationship. Again, we don't want to be completely transparent, because there are things that we can't be transparent about in industry, intellectual property rights, trade secrets, these sorts of things are really important. Also, communicating errors quickly, another aspect of communication. This builds trust as well. Not making errors unnecessarily is very important. So due care and diligence. This is a legal requirement, of course. We operate under that as lawyers, as a requirement, often as an ethical obligation in law, in legislation, certainly is in Australia. So, we have all of these aspects, but it boils down to trust, and those aspects that I've mentioned are packaged around that. I think that's the way it would answer that. Has that answered the question?
Almost, because you are talking about building trust, which obviously takes time. It cannot be built in one day. You'll have to consistently work on gaining trust from, say, clients, even friends, any acquaintances you have. They build trust, and trust comes, obviously, as you said, from respect. So while you are talking
100%,
about all
100%.
these positive and authentic ways and the way you have contributed to the industry, how did you actually integrate these things in the professional world, where you, as you rightly said, that you cannot be 100% transparent when it comes to, let's say, intellectual properties and other aspects of law? How did you internalize this in your business world, in your professional endeavors, especially when it comes to corporate governance and the kind of leadership or executive leaderships with whom you have dealt with all your life? How did all this work around and you stayed positive and your contribution to the world was authentic?
Well, authenticity, another big word. It's also, that's a principle of good corporate governance, in my opinion, too. Often misused or misappropriated, that word, but it's exceptionally important. As you were asking that question, I thought of something I could have said and will add here to the last question, which is really important to the answering of this one, which is the authentic question is also about an authentic compassion and empathy. That's something we often term today emotional intelligence. And I think you need to, in good communication as well, we need to be thinking about what the other person is feeling and thinking. So the point of view of the other person is a really important feature to be aware of and to draw out as well. We need to draw that out of the other person. It's not just a technical function that we're performing, it's a very personal one in a way too. Remembering, of course, we're wearing a fiduciary hat in the boardroom, usually, but even in advisory boards, it's important to do this as well because there's obligation there. There's certainly liability, even in an advisory board situation, for representations and misrepresentations and those sorts of things, misstatements, for example. So wearing a, but to the fiduciary, I think this is really important. Empathizing and trying to sit in the seat of your client and the boardroom and the people in the board and understand them very well. You can't always do this quickly, to your point, of course, but you can. I think you get probably better at it over time, but you've got to do a little bit of research as well. You've got to find out as much as you can about the people too, and you need to do that beforehand, before meeting them, but also when you meet them. I think it's important too, just though also just to be open, and this is sometimes very difficult, to be open and to some degree vulnerable at the same time as credible, and in the combination of those, without arrogance, acting with humility but with professional expertise, and clearly bringing expertise in an authoritative way. Must make sure that we do it clearly, concisely, and accurately. We need to be dependable. People need to be able to rely on that. You cannot make a mistake in those first instances. So you must be very solid. And in that way, once we engage with vulnerability and humility and authority, I think that tends to build it. So, the idea of bringing ego, is, I think, fatal. There is, of course, ego in the boardroom. There is, of course, ego in leadership and management. But good leadership and management and good governance, again, I think it's anathema to ego. Positive ego is fine, but ego, when it starts to be detrimental, when it starts to be pernicious, I think we need to take that out of the equation and not worry about it, because I'm sure as we go, everyone who cares about their role becomes a good professional. Varying degrees, of course, but success, to mention this as a sort of a rounding out point, because you mentioned it about contribution, success is not just defined as achievements or monetary, in a monetary sense, or these sorts of things. It's got to be defined by a contribution. And I think that's, if I was to think about what good business practice is, what good ethical business practice is, it doesn't start with an organization pronouncing itself. It starts with an organization doing the right things, which is good governance and good management practices and good customer service and being a good corporate citizen. So good corporate citizenship, as well as ethical behaviors and doing the right thing, the right thing well, that's an act of stewardship. Servant leadership, as some people call this, and I think that's the way to be. And you cannot be a servant leader and be arrogant.
Being clear, being conscious, and being accurate, I start thinking that they are the kind of cornerstones or building blocks for building trust, I guess. And that is something whenever you are talking about this, that only comes to my mind. That is how we build trust. It takes time, it takes honesty, it takes clarity, it takes being adequate and being very clear about your views. And when you are doing that, you definitely will achieve leadership, be it servant leadership, be it corporate leadership. But when in the new world which you are currently, and you have seen your world for past 40 years, as you said, what all changes have you seen, and the kind of things which you foresee that will come up as emerging trends, or they will become challenge for the future generations when you start thinking about corporate governance, law, and the executive leadership which we are looking forward to? How do you make it simple, and what kind of trends do you think one should be focusing on while they are building their practice?
What changes have I seen? Well, I guess I've seen a technological revolution, as people of my generation will have. I remember that when I first went to university, there was no computer. There were no computers. I wrote all of my first assignments by hand. And then I think in third year, there was one computer, and that was one computer per dormitory. And you had to book in. There was a matrix on the door, and you had to write in when you were going to use the computer, and we all took turns. So, from there through then the personal computer revolution, the revolution from even mainframe, albeit that mainframe still exists today, to client server, and then on to cloud today, and into edge computing, as Gartner call it, or very, very distributed data hosting and data management. It hasn't been a complete revolution either in terms of technology. It's not been points or punctuated equilibrium, as we might say in an evolutionary sense, although that could be a good analogy. There's been changes and then points of change, tipping points perhaps. I think we're in one now with respect to artificial intelligence because of an exponential growth in capability with LLM, generative AI, but other forms of model as well for AI use case. But across that span, the internet happened, and it certainly happened, and then it proliferated, it propagated. So technology, and then beyond into .com, and then everything to the web ideals, and then beyond that to the development of things that the web does, not just Internet of Things, but the things that communicate for technologies to be able to work today, whether it's supply chain management end to end, or whether it might be satellite communications, or whether it might be remote telemetry communications, and data analysis or data capture, data collection, data collation, data analysis, business intelligence, predictive capabilities beyond that, and then dissemination and usage of data as well. These are very interesting things. All of this has developed rather rapidly with technologies around them. So in my career, I've seen that. That's certainly changed the way that we do business. It's certainly changed the way that we interact. We all recognize that. So some of the things, and I think this might interest you as well, is that I've seen some psychological changes that go along with this also. I think I've seen some relationship and interaction changes that have gone along with that. And that's much more differentiated today between native users of digital technologies and those of us who were not native users, but also the way that we conducted ourselves with each other. And so there's some very big changes socially, or in terms of social interaction. And I mean social in the broader sense there, professionally as well as personally. I think that's a very big part of the change that I've seen. How have I managed that? I don't think it was for me or people like me of my generation. I'm a part of the forgotten generation. I'm a Gen Xer. I'm an early Gen Xer. And so we've seen those changes, but we've had to adapt. We just had to, because the digital thing happened to us. We were there and it was like, oh, wow, okay, we're not native to this and we grew up without this. But, there we were, and we were 30 and we were going, wow, it's just this, wow, this just has all happened. We have to keep up and we have to become that. Maybe there's an element of adaptability that was forced on us in that too. It's interesting. And so, or some did and maybe some didn't, more or less, but to a degree we all had to. And then there were those who responded to it very well, but had to add that to our repertoire, to our skill sets, skill and knowledge sets. I guess in some ways fortunate to have been in technology and to have been around that and gained an understanding of that in all of its ways, from whether that was in project management or whether that was in compliance regulation law or whether it was in IT services management, service management contracts, professional services contracts, all of those things, or strategy in that respect too. I think we all need to do this, though. It's another aspect of when I think about what I've had to do and what our generation had to do and the other generations coming now. I think what's really important is to know that you need to keep learning. So this is a continuous learning issue. And in order to not keep up, but maintain and to engage, contribute, and also from a point of view of belonging, we all need to be able to do this. So I think there's an important social and psychological aspect to this of belonging, but continuously learning and being able to interact. And trust is important to those relationships and interactions too. And there's only one way that you can create value, and that's through interaction. None of us can create value alone, unless it's for ourselves, but that's not a contribution. So we're all a part of a continuum. And I think we need to have and address this psychological need for belonging and for interaction by maintaining and continuously learning.
While you were talking
That's
about being adaptable, you are quite a lot. You have been through a whole phase of no internet to some internet and to the explosion of internet and the ideas and the kind of exchanges we have. Like currently we can see that I'm sitting in India somewhere in a remote place, and then you are in Australia, and we are interacting, and we are trying to reach to masses where we can impart such kind of thoughts which have generated over years. You have developed a sense of not only adaptability but kind of responsibility. And bringing back to that thing, I would like to ask you, what do you suggest for the kind of aspiring business leaders that we see today, or the legal heads, executives, or the first generation lawyers who want to develop some specific skills? What kind of skills should they concentrate on, or the kind of attributes that you believe will or are very crucial for kind of success that you have seen in the changing business environment which you already have seen over the years? I would love to hear your suggestions for the learners, for the listeners, and everyone.
it's a great question, a very, very good question. In some ways, I think I've touched on it in the continuous learning aspect. So what attributes? I'll discuss, I guess, as we go, the attributes, but I think the aim is probably always to develop trust. So some of the attributes, key skills, I would say hard skills are very important. What are the challenges that we have today, though? Let's start there. And how do we frame the challenges? What's at the center of the challenges? I think for me, what's at the center of the challenges is stakeholders. And, in a corporate governance sense, in a corporate sense, but I want to move beyond the corporate and say in the governance sense, ethical management, doing things responsibly is really important. So you must appreciate, and by appreciation, I mean you must understand your stakeholders. You know who they are, identify them, know who they are, and understand them. And through understanding, create a connection. And I think this connection is very important. And that's without correction either. We need to think in terms of that person's point of view. Connection, not correction. Connection in terms of who they are and not who we are necessarily. And to go back then to thinking about the challenges, how do we apply that? What framework do we need to use to apply this idea of trust and stakeholder and interaction and communication and all the things that we've talked about in order to achieve a positive outcome, positive outcomes. That's for ourselves, for our interlocutors, for our organization, for our partners, for the world, for the planet, for other people, for society. I mean, these are important questions and important attributes or factors. So, the big challenges today are very clear to us, I think. Hyperconnectivity is certainly one from a technological point of view, because it creates complexity in the regulatory, in the operating sense. Many different proliferating technologies that are emerging and becoming much more powerful, not just AI, but quantum computing, which will also exponentially grow the impact of some of the other, in fact, the web of emerging technologies. So quantum computing, for example, I think also blockchain, very important. Definitely being regulated now, but it has use cases beyond crypto, and many people don't realize that, or they connect crypto and blockchain, but there's so many use cases beyond cryptocurrency or digital currency. But of course, that's going to be something that CDBCs are utilized on the basis of. They're going to sit on platforms which are propagating blockchain from a security point of view, whether it's tokenized or otherwise, and government fiat oriented in terms of regulated or otherwise. There's something that was coming. I think I saw that and I said it. I wrote it in 2018. It's in a blockchain paper that I wrote in 2018, which is on my LinkedIn profile even. We've got a lot of these things happening all together, and we've got robotics, and we've got newly generated materials, for example, for semiconducting or conducting, therefore adding to the quantum computing equation. And so all of these things are coming, and they're developing rapidly, AI, of course, and that increases both the risk and the opportunity. And they're two sides of the same coin. Risk, opportunity being strategy, opportunity for invention and creation, and risk on the other side of that coin for mitigation and responsibility. And we have to balance those out. We need to learn about that. We need to learn the hard stuff. We need to learn the technologies. We need to learn the frameworks. We need to learn the law. We need to learn the business skills, the out of the text, out of the theory. You and I have said before, there's nothing stronger than a powerful theory or an idea whose time has come. These are important things. That is a hygiene factor, however. That is a zero line to me. That's where we just need to be to subsist. The greatest skills are the skills that are soft, the things we've talked about in terms of emotional intelligence, connection, alignment, values, understanding, EQ, not just IQ. That's where I see people, it's great to have lots of knowledge, but to have great communication skills and trust building skills is very, very important. And that requires some focus. So it's people orientation, not just task, not just technical or the technocratic understanding. Absolutely need it. So set your mind on that. And we need to learn that over time continuously. We certainly need to maintain and build a body of knowledge for ourselves so that we can continue to contribute and to lead, hopefully. And by leading, I mean educating and schooling and imparting knowledge, and not in a pontifical way, but in a way that's generous. It has a generous spirit. So, and that doesn't mean that we don't need to be business oriented, because we do. I'm not suggesting that for a moment that we need to give things away or not to make money. We do need to make money. We all need to make money, and therefore we need that for our basic needs. I think what we need to think about is that we need to ensure reasonable reward for reasonable effort. And we need to define what reasonable is for ourselves and for the rest of the people around us and the planet.
I guess we will soon be learning more and more about it on LinkedIn and other newsletters which you develop. the kind of attitude which you are talking about is lifelong learning. You have to keep on learning and changing your aspects of understanding regarding the emerging tech, like you talked about quantum computing, blockchains, AI. Everything around us is changing with time. So while we are going to be concluding the interview soon, what would be your message or insight that you would like to share with our audience, especially the ones who are first generation lawyers, particularly who are interested in law, governance, leadership, and in understanding of global business dynamics? What would be your share?
Yeah, we've touched on it in many ways, but I'll see if I can summarize and encapsulate. I think that what's exceptionally important is to understand that you are a lawyer and you carry the fiduciary, you carry responsibility. This is a responsibility that's so important in every society. However lawyers are perceived, and sometimes they're perceived poorly, I often think that's, and I'm sure we've all talked about it, that's because of the portrayal of the shark lawyer or shyster lawyer in Hollywood movies or television shows, which isn't the way most lawyers are. So it's important to recognize that we have ethical obligations and that ours is a highest standard. It is an utmost uberime fides responsibility. The reason that I say that is because the lawyers are people who set the example. And I know that there are all types of different lawyers, but we all have this responsibility and we have a personal accountability for that. So I think in terms of the way we operate, as I just said a moment ago, it's important to make money, but how we make money and how our clients make money is also important, very important. Profit maximization leads to all sorts of, in my mind, aberrant behaviors. I think that a collaboration orientation, some have termed this collaboration capitalism. I certainly have. And again, this is not to say that we don't compete, but not to see competition as something that you're externalizing, but rather internalizing, being the best we can be. That's important to the lawyer, and it's important to governance. It's important to the business, particularly in the stakeholder world that we occupy today, where stakeholders have such a great influence over the perception of the company and the way that organizations, not just corporations, but organizations are perceived, and therefore the way that they might be limited in their freedom of action that they might otherwise not had they behaved better. I think these are extremely important points. So that, I think, is how I would encapsulate that we need to be values oriented, that we need to live our values. We need to be stakeholder aware and oriented. We need to be thinking about others outside of us and then how we serve them, as well as serving ourselves. And all of the context that we have in terms of the major risks and challenges that the world faces today, whether it's climate change, or whether it's artificial intelligence or technology all around, whether it's misinformation, disinformation, which is a technological issue and I think an ethical and governance and a regulatory issue. It's certainly a business behavioural issue from a technology or digital platforms or demand aggregator point of view. How do we determine how we're going to place a value on, for example, user data? That's value to the firm, but also its uncompensated value to the firm and how that information is used. Personalization, for example, extremely important. How algorithms are developed on that basis, extremely important. The process is governed for biases and blind spots in terms of development so that they're ethical and responsible systems and produce ethical, responsible outcomes. All extremely important to how we make money, not just making money. Again, so it's about contribution, not just what's in it for ourselves. I think this is very much a lawyer's ethical obligation that we carry because of our fiduciary and because this profession has such an ability to impact and influence for good and for not so good.
Thank you, Stephen, for accepting our invite and imparting your knowledge spanning over 40 years. And it is highly appreciated. And thank you so much. once again from LawSikho, from SuperLawyer and Skill Arbitrage. We love the conversation. We want to let learners know that they have to first build trust, be honest, and keep on doing the learning forever so that they can move forward and build their name as you have built it in the business world. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.